Chapter 1. An Echo of Ash. The sky wept. A cold, miserable drizzle slicked the training grounds into a pit of mud and misery. It smelled of churned earth, of sweat, of the coppery tang of split lips and bloody noses. For Alpha Riker, it smelled like progress. He stood beneath the ancient skeletal branches of a great oak, motionless as a statue carved from granite and fury. His black jacket shed the rain in shimmering beads, but a chill deeper than the weather had settled in his bones years ago. Before him, his warriors fought, not with the calculated grace of a spar, but with the desperate, ugly snarls of a real fight. Bone cracked against bone. A younger wolf, barely out of his teens, went down with a wet gasp, clutching a ribs that were definitely broken. Riker's eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, narrowed on the victor. Kale. Big, strong, and sloppy. He moved without a sound. The mud didn't dare suck at his boots. He stopped beside the panting warrior, his presence a sudden drop in temperature. "You left your left flank exposed." Riker's voice was a low rumble, devoid of heat, which made it all the more terrifying. "For a full 2 seconds." Kale's chest puffed out, blood and rain trickling from a cut above his eye. "He went down, Alpha." "He went down slowly," Riker countered, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. "In a real fight, 2 seconds is an eternity. It's the space between a heartbeat and a death rattle. It's the moment your enemy's claws rip your throat out while you're busy celebrating." He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. "It's the mistake that gets your pack killed. Because you were sloppy." He let the words hang in the air, heavier than the rain clouds. He saw the flicker of understanding, the shame that replaced the pride in Kale's eyes. Good. Fear was a better teacher than pride. He turned away, the scene already fading from his mind. His real destination was just beyond the training grounds, a place he only visited when the ghosts of the past screamed louder than the duties of the present. A simple, polished granite stone stood beneath a weeping willow. There was no name, just a date. The day his world had burned to ash. His father. He had been a kind alpha, a beloved leader. And his kindness had gotten him and 24 others slaughtered. They'd trusted a rival pack. They'd offered diplomacy instead of showing their teeth. Riker remembered the scent of the smoke, the screams, the sight of his father's body. He had been weak, and Riker had sworn on his shallow grave that he would never, ever make the same mistake. He built his pack into a weapon because weapons didn't get sentimental. They didn't get betrayed. A twig snapped behind him. Riker didn't flinch. He knew the scent. Damon, his beta, his oldest friend. "Alpha?" Damon's voice was soft, respectful. "I'm sorry to disturb you." Riker stared at the stone. "What is it?" "A report from the Eastern Patrol. They picked up a scent." Damon paused, letting the weight of it settle. "A rogue, near the Whisperwood border. The tracks were fresh." Riker finally turned, his face a mask of cold control. The grief was gone, locked away in its cage. In its place was the Alpha. One rogue is not a threat. "This one is different," Damon pressed, his brow furrowed with what looked like genuine concern. The scent, it was strange, twisted, not right, and it was heading toward the ridges, toward the weakest part of our territory. He took a step closer. "It's where Lyra likes to run." The name hit Riker like a physical blow. Lyra, his sister, the one piece of his past that he couldn't encase in armor. The one person whose safety was a constant, aching vulnerability in his chest. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along the sharp line. "Double the patrols. I want eyes on every inch of that border." The command was absolute, a blade of sound cutting through the rain. He was the Alpha, the protector, the shield. And he would let nothing and no one ever break his pack again. Chapter 2. A Whisper on the Wind. The world inside Isolde's cabin was a universe away from the mud and blood of the Moonwood pack. Here, the air hummed with the scent of life, of drying lavender, of simmering chamomile, of the rich, dark soil clinging to the roots of a mandrake she'd just repotted. Sunlight, thick and golden as honey, streamed through the paned glass of her window, illuminating the swirling dust motes like tiny dancing fairies. She was alone. She was always alone. And she was content. Mostly. Her fingers, stained green and brown from her work, gently coaxed a new leaf on a silver-leafed fern. "There now," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic thing, rarely used for anyone but her plants. "You see? A little bit of sun, a little bit of care. That's all we ever really need, isn't it?" The fern, of course, did not answer, but Isolde felt a response all the same, a gentle, thrumming pulse of contentment from the life force within it. She could feel all of it. The quiet, steady life of the forest around her, the slow, patient breathing of the ancient trees, the frantic, hurried heartbeats of the rabbits and squirrels. It was a constant, gentle symphony, and she was its sole audience. But lately, there had been a new sound, a dissonance. A strange energy had been gathering at the edges of her awareness for weeks. It felt hungry. A low, static hum that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. It was a magic she didn't recognize, something wild and untamed that felt nothing like the gentle, life-giving energy she worked with. She tried to ignore it, to push it away. Her life was quiet because she had made it quiet. The world outside her little patch of woods was full of noise and chaos, things she wanted no part of. She was a healer, a gardener, not an adventurer. She moved to her workbench, a beautiful scarred piece of oak covered in clay pots, glass vials, and bundles of drying herbs. She picked up a mortar and pestle to grind some willow bark for a headache tincture. But as she began to work, the feeling returned. Stronger this time. A pull. It was a physical sensation, like a string tied to the very center of her chest, tugging her insistently eastward, toward the dark, tangled woods that marked the territory of the wolves. She shivered, her knuckles white around the pestle. She knew the stories. Everyone did. The shifters who lived in those woods were territorial, violent. A human, especially one like her, would not be welcome. She tried to focus on her work, on the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the pestle crushing the bark. Ground yourself, she thought. Feel the wood in your hands. Smell the sharp, clean scent of the willow. Be here. Just be here. But the pull wouldn't stop. It was a persistent, nagging whisper in her soul. Something is wrong. Something is coming. And then it happened. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a sight. It was a feeling. A blinding flash of light, not in the sky, but inside her own mind. A surge of raw, powerful magic ripped through the forest. So potent, so violent, it felt like a silent scream that echoed in every fiber of her being. The glass vials on her shelf rattled. The water in a nearby bowl trembled. Isolde dropped the pestle. It clattered to the floor, the sound shockingly loud in the sudden, ringing silence. The pull was no longer a gentle tug. It was a desperate, unbreakable rope, yanking her, demanding her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, terrifying silence of the forest. The gentle symphony was gone, replaced by a single deafening note of pure panic and pain. It was coming from the east, from the heart of the wolflands. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know why it was calling to her. But she knew one thing with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. She had to go. Now. Chapter 3. A Scent of Blood and Lies. Panic was a luxury Alpha Riker had forbidden himself years ago, but as his enforcer, Marcus, stood panting in the doorway of the council room, his face the color of ash, Riker felt the cold, familiar coils of it tighten around his heart. What? The word was a crack of a whip. It's Lyra, Alpha, Marcus choked out. She went for her run. She hasn't returned. The world narrowed to a single point. Lyra. Out there. With a rogue wolf on the loose. The carefully constructed walls around his emotions didn't just crack, they vaporized. He was moving before Marcus finished the sentence, a blur of shadow and fury, his long strides eating up the ground. He shoved past the enforcer, his mind a roaring vortex of a single desperate thought. Find her. He hit the edge of the woods at a dead sprint, his senses exploding outward. The scents of pine and damp earth were overwhelmed by what he was truly searching for. There. Faint, but unmistakable. The unique scent of his sister, a mix of wildflowers and the subtle metallic tang of the rare illness that made her wolf weaker than it should be. It was the reason he was so damn protective, because she couldn't always protect herself. His most trusted trackers were right behind him, Damon at his side, his expression a grim mirror of Riker's own terror. They followed the trail, a path of crushed leaves and snapped twigs. It was erratic, uneven. She'd been running hard. Was she running for pleasure? Or from fear? Please, Moon Goddess, not from fear. Then, the unthinkable happened. The trail just stopped. One moment, her scent was there, a fragile thread in the tapestry of the forest. The next, it was gone, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. How? Riker's voice was a raw growl. How is that possible? His trackers exchanged confused, frightened glances. One of them, an old wolf named Elias, shook his head, his face pale. I've never lost a scent like this. It's like it was scrubbed from the air. It's not natural. Riker's wolf clawed at the inside of his skin, a raging beast demanding to be let out. He wanted to tear the forest apart, tree by tree, until he found her. Helplessness was a poison, and he could feel it seeping into his veins. This was exactly what his father had felt. This paralyzing terror. This failure. Over here! Damon's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. Riker turned. His beta was 20 yards away, kneeling by a thicket of thorn bushes. He pointed to the ground. There's another trail. Fainter. But I smell blood. Riker was there in a heartbeat, his heart threatening to pound its way out of his chest. He dropped to his knees. Damon was right. The scent was different, muddled. But underneath the stench of something dark and corrupted, he could smell two things that made his world tilt on its axis. Lyra's blood, and the cloying, sweet smell of unfamiliar magic. Witchcraft, Elias spat, the word a curse. No wolf could do this. This is dark magic. She was taken. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying speed. The rogue, the unnatural, twisted scent Damon had mentioned. The trail that vanished. The new one, laced with magic and his sister's blood. It was a calculated attack. An abduction. The rogue was just a distraction, or maybe a weapon wielded by someone far more dangerous. The trail leads this way, Damon said, his voice grim and steady. Toward the outer territories. Riker's mind was a storm of rage and grief. His carefully controlled world had been shattered, and his only focus was the person responsible. He would find them. He would make them pay. He would unmake their entire world and salt the earth where it once stood. This was his fault. He hadn't been strong enough, hadn't been vigilant enough. He'd let this happen. Again. They moved fast. A silent hunting party driven by their alpha's cold, simmering fury. The fabricated trail was a breadcrumb path of rage, leading them deeper into the woods, away from where Lyra had actually escaped. It led them toward a small, isolated clearing, and in the center of that clearing, smoke curled lazily from the chimney of a small stone cabin. The scent of that strange magic was thick here, clinging to the air like a shroud. It poured from the little house, a beacon of everything he now hated. His trackers slowed, looking to him for orders. But Riker didn't stop. His vision tunneled. All he saw was that cabin. All he smelled was the magic that had stolen his sister. He didn't feel the branches that whipped at his face. He didn't feel the burn in his lungs. All he felt was a singular, clarifying purpose, a promise of annihilation. He broke through the last line of trees, and a roar ripped from his throat. a sound that was not human, a sound of pure, undiluted alpha rage. It was a promise of the vengeance he was about to unleash upon the witch inside. Chapter 4. A Vow of Vengeance, a Scent of Fate. The roar was the sound of a soul tearing itself apart. It ripped from Riker's throat, a promise of death that echoed through the unnaturally quiet clearing. He didn't use the handle. His shoulder met the thick oak of the cabin door, and the world exploded in a shower of splinters and torn hinges. He was inside, a predator unleashed. His only thought was to find the witch who had taken his sister, to feel her life break beneath his hands. He saw a figure, a woman, her eyes wide with terror, small, fragile. He lunged, and then it hit him. The scent. It wasn't the cloying magic he'd smelled on the trail. This was something else, something that bypassed his rage and struck him straight in the soul. It was the smell of old books and dried lilac, of fresh rain on warm earth, of a crackling fire on a winter night. It was the scent of home, a home he'd never known he was missing. His wolf, the beast of fury and vengeance he'd nurtured for years, reared up inside him. Not with a snarl, but with a howl of pure, agonizing recognition. Mine. The word was a brand on his heart. Mate. His lunge faltered. He froze mid-stride, his muscles locked, his body caught in a war he didn't understand. His mind, the Alpha's mind, screamed at him. It's a trick, a glamour. She's using her magic to fool you. Kill her. But the wolf wept. Ours. Protect. Safe. Claim. His stormy eyes locked on hers. He saw not a cunning witch, but a terrified woman, a woman with eyes the color of moss after a long rain. Then he saw it, past her, on a small cot in the corner of the room. Lyra, not broken, not bleeding out. She was sleeping, a deep, peaceful sleep. A poultice of green herbs was carefully spread across the gash on her leg, and the angry red of the wound was already fading. She was safe. She was healing. The two realities crashed together in his head with the force of a tidal wave. The woman he had come to execute was the one destined to be his. The witch he had blamed for Lyra's abduction was the one who had saved her. Nothing made sense. The rage that had been his fuel for a decade sputtered, leaving behind a hollow, aching confusion. Who was this woman, and what had she just done to his world? The sound that shattered Isolde's quiet life was a sound from a nightmare, a roar that was more beast than man. Before she could even process it, her front door ceased to exist. It blew inward, ripped from its frame by a force of nature disguised as a man. He filled the space, a giant of muscle and shadow, his face a mask of such pure, murderous rage that her breath caught in her lungs. His eyes, they were the color of a winter storm, and they were fixed on her with the promise of absolute destruction. This is how I die, she thought, a strange, calm certainty settling over her terror. He moved, a blur of deadly grace. She braced for the impact, for the snap of bone, the end of everything. But it never came. He stopped just a few feet away, his body rigid, a war playing out across his handsome, terrifying features. The rage in his eyes was still there, but it was diluted. Something else was fighting its way to the surface. A flash of gold, a flicker of shock and pain. Isolde felt a bizarre jolt in her own blood, a hum that seemed to answer the thunder rolling off of him. A connection. It was insane. It was impossible. But it was there. She had felt him before he ever arrived. She started, her voice a pathetic little squeak. Your sister, she was hurt. I found her at the edge of the woods. I helped. He didn't seem to be listening. His gaze was locked on her, but it was as if he were seeing two different things at once. The monster, and something else entirely. Finally, his gaze flickered past her, to Lyra sleeping on the cot. He saw his sister, safe. The tension in his shoulders shifted but didn't release. He took a step forward. Isolde flinched back. He reached out and she squeezed her eyes shut. But instead of a blow, His hand closed around her upper arm. His touch wasn't brutal. It was possessive. A current of pure energy shot through her, hot and shocking, stealing what little breath she had left. "You're coming with me," he growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her bones. His men were crowding the doorway now, their faces hard and suspicious. He turned to them, pulling her against his side. "She's not a prisoner," he announced, his voice carrying the undeniable weight of an alpha's command. "She's under my protection." Isolde looked up at him, bewildered. She saw the lie in his eyes, but she also saw a terrifying, confusing truth. He was still fighting a war inside himself, and somehow, she was the battlefield. Chapter 5. A House of Wolves. Being dragged into the Moonwood pack house was like being plunged into a sea of hostility. Isolde had lived her life in quiet solitude, surrounded by the gentle hum of growing things. This place was the opposite of life. It was a cacophony of simmering aggression. The air was thick with the smell of dozens of wolves, of damp fur, of roasting meat, and something else, something sharp and unwelcoming, distrust. It was aimed at her like 1,000 tiny daggers. Everywhere she looked, eyes followed her, cold, predatory eyes that saw her not as a person, but as an infestation. A thing that didn't belong. The man beside her, the alpha named Riker, was a confusing storm of contradictions. One moment his hand was an iron clamp on her arm, his body a possessive wall between her and his pack. The next, he was cold and distant, his jaw tight, refusing to even look at her. His hot and cold behavior was more terrifying than outright anger. The strange sickness that had been a quiet whisper in her veins for weeks was growing louder here. It felt like the weight of all their suspicion was feeding it, making the curse in her blood heavy and sluggish. It was a struggle just to stay upright. "Alpha," a smooth voice cut through the tension. A man stepped forward, handsome and smiling, though the smile didn't quite reach his dark, calculating eyes. He was the one they called Damon, the beta. "The pack is Carl concerned. You bring a human into our hall, after what happened to Lyra." "Lyra is safe because of her." Riker's voice was flat, daring anyone to challenge him. Damon's smile widened. "Of course, but you must understand their fear. She smells of strange magic. Perhaps she could show us she means no harm. Help with the evening meal preparations. A simple gesture of goodwill." It was a test, a trap. Isolde knew it. But Riker gave a curt nod, releasing her arm as if he'd been burned. The sudden loss of contact left her feeling cold and terrifyingly exposed. A woman with a hard face shoved a heavy wooden tray of vegetables into her hands and pointed toward the kitchens. Isolde's hands trembled as she walked. She could feel every glare, hear every whispered comment. The pressure was immense. The sickness in her gut churned, a nauseating wave of dizziness washing over her. The room began to tilt. The hostile energy of the pack was a physical force, pressing in on her, suffocating her. It was too much. Riker watched her walk away, and his wolf paced restlessly under his skin. It hated letting her go. It wanted to pull her back, stand over her, and snarl at anyone who dared to look at her. He violently suppressed the urge. He was an alpha. He had to be in control. But control felt like a distant shore, and he was lost in a raging sea. He felt the pack's judgment. He was their leader, their unbreakable shield, and he had just brought a potential threat into their home, acting on an instinct he couldn't explain or justify. Every fiber of his being screamed that she was his mate. But his mind, the mind shaped by his father's bloody death, screamed that trust was a fool's game. He couldn't reconcile the two. So he chose to do nothing. He chose to be the cold, distant alpha. It was safer. He could feel her fear through the bond that was already snapping into place between them. It was a faint, trembling thread, but it was there. Her terror felt like sandpaper scraping against his own nerves. It was infuriating because he didn't know how to fix it. He couldn't show her softness. That would be weakness, and he had sworn he would never be weak again. So he turned his back on her. engaging Damon in a conversation about patrol schedules, pretending his world hadn't just been shattered and remade in the last hour. He tried to focus on his duties, on the familiar weight of his responsibilities as Alpha. But it was like trying to ignore a fire raging in his own house. Everything in him was screaming her name. Then he heard the sound, a sharp gasp, followed by the deafening crash of wood and ceramic shattering on the stone floor. Silence descended upon the great hall. A heavy, suffocating silence. Riker turned. His heart stopped. Isolde was standing there swaying, her face as white as bone. The tray lay in pieces at her feet, food scattered across the floor. A child near the kitchen started to cry. From the corner of the room, a low, menacing growl rumbled from the chest of one of his senior warriors. The disgust in the room was a palpable thing, a thick, oily poison. And it was all aimed at her, at his mate, at his. Chapter 6. The Alpha's Choice. The sound of the crash was a physical blow to Riker. He saw the scene in a horrifying slow-motion clarity. Isolde, pale and trembling, the shattered remains of the tray, the pack's collective judgment hardening into open hostility. He saw the sneer on Kyle's face. He heard the low growl rumbling in the corner. They were looking at her like she was filth, like she was a stray dog that had wandered into their den. And in that moment, the war inside him ended. One side won, decisively. It wasn't the Alpha, the cold, calculating leader who weighed every decision for the good of the pack. It wasn't the grieving son who saw betrayal around every corner. It was the wolf. The primal, possessive beast that lived in his soul rose up with a roar that was silent but shook him to his very core. Mine. The thought was not his own. It was a command from a power far older than reason. Protect. Mine. He didn't think. He simply acted. Before anyone could say a word, before Kale's sneer could fully form, before that growl could escalate, Riker was moving. He crossed the great hall in 3 long, silent strides. The pack parted before him like the sea before a storm. He reached Isolde just as her eyes began to roll back in her head. Her knees buckled. He caught her. He didn't just steady her. He swept her up into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. The contact was a jolt of lightning through his system. She was so fragile, so small against his chest. He could feel the frantic, frightened flutter of her heart against his ribs. He tucked her head against his shoulder, instinctively shielding her from the prying, judgmental eyes of his own people. A collective gasp went through the hall. He could feel their shock, their disbelief. He could see it on Damon's face, a flicker of something that looked suspiciously like fury before it was masked by surprise. Riker didn't care. He looked down at the woman in his arms, at the dark smudges of exhaustion under her eyes, and a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade washed over him. A fierce, terrifying protectiveness that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with her. He had made his choice. He just hadn't realized it until this very second. Ignoring the stunned silence of his pack, he turned and strode toward the stone staircase that led to his private wing. He was breaking every rule, every tradition. An Alpha's chambers were his sanctuary. No outsider was ever permitted. But she wasn't an outsider. His wolf knew it. And right now, the wolf was in charge. Humiliation burned on Isolde's skin. The world was spinning, the faces of the wolves blurring into a gallery of disgust. She heard the growl. She felt their hatred. She expected to be cast out, to be hurt, to be punished for her weakness. Instead, she was falling. And then, she was caught. She found herself lifted off the ground, cradled against a chest as hard and unyielding as a mountain. She looked up, dazed, into Riker's face. The storm was still in his eyes, but it wasn't aimed at her anymore. It was aimed at the world, at anyone who dared to threaten her. She saw something there she never would have expected. Pure, undiluted possession. She felt the shock ripple through the room as he carried her. She was the fuse. He was the flame. And they had just started a fire in the heart of his pack. The dizzying weakness was overwhelming, the curse a leaden weight pulling her down into darkness. She could only cling to him, the one solid thing in her collapsing world. He carried her up a flight of stone stairs and down a quiet, torch-lit hallway. The heavy scent of pine and old leather and him, it was all around her. He stopped in front of a massive oak door and pushed it open with his shoulder. He carried her over the threshold. The door clicked shut behind them, the sound echoing in the sudden, profound silence. The noise of the pack, the weight of their hatred, the tension of the hall. It all vanished. It was just them. He didn't put her down immediately. He just stood there in the center of the vast, fire-lit room holding her. The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken questions and a raw, undeniable energy. The strange connection she'd felt in her cabin, the hum in her blood, it was no longer a whisper, it was a deafening roar. It was the only thing she could hear in the entire world, and it was terrifying. And it was beautiful. Chapter 7. Cages of Stone and Skin. The heavy oak door clicked shut, and the sound was as final as a prison gate slamming. The sudden, suffocating silence in the room was a living thing. It pressed in on Isolde from all sides. For a long moment, Riker just stood there, holding her, his chest a solid wall of muscle and heat. The air between them was electric, a storm of things unsaid, of feelings unnamed. It was fear. It was confusion. And it was something else. A deep, resonant hum that vibrated from him to her and back again, a current connecting two shores that had never meant to meet. Finally, with a strange, almost hesitant gentleness, he set her on her feet. The loss of his warmth was immediate, leaving her cold and unsteady. The room was a cage, no matter how grand. Dark, polished wood gleamed in the firelight. The scent of old leather, of wood smoke, of him, filled every corner. It was a space built for a predator. All sharp angles and heavy shadows. She felt like a mouse in a lion's den. Her fear was a frantic bird beating its wings against her ribs. She needed space. She needed to breathe air that wasn't saturated with his overwhelming presence. She took a clumsy step back, then another, her eyes wide as she scanned for exits that weren't there. Her hip bumped against the hard corner of a massive desk. A sharp sting of pain shot up her arm. "Don't!" His voice was a low growl, rough as gravel. She froze, thinking he was angry at her for touching his things. But when she dared to look at him, the rage was gone from his eyes. In its place was something else. An intense, focused darkness that was somehow more unsettling. His gaze was fixed on her arm. Riker watched her retreat, and it felt like a physical blow. The wolf inside him whined, a pathetic, wounded sound. It wanted to close the distance, to pull her back, to surround her with his scent and promise her she was safe. But the Alpha, the man built from the ashes of his father's failure, held him in check. He couldn't be soft. He couldn't be weak. This woman was a mystery, a witch. She healed his sister, but the trail of dark magic led straight to her door. Who was she? Was she a trap sent by his enemies? He needed answers. He needed to be the interrogator, the judge, the executioner if necessary. He was supposed to be in control, but the scent of her, the feel of her small frame in his arms, it was shredding his control, piece by painful piece. Then he saw her stumble. He saw the flash of pain on her face. He saw the thin line of red welling up on the pale skin of her forearm. Blood. Her blood. A snarl ripped from his chest before he could stop it. A possessive, feral sound. The sight of her injury, no matter how small, ignited a firestorm in his gut. An instinct older and more powerful than reason screamed at him to go to her, to lick the wound clean, to destroy whatever had dared to harm her. Even if it was just a piece of furniture. But before he could take a single step, he saw her do something that made the world stop. She cradled her injured arm. Her head bowed, and she whispered something. The words were too quiet to hear, a murmur like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind. Her fingers pressed against the cut. For a fleeting second, a soft, ethereal green light glowed beneath her skin, warm and gentle as new spring growth. She pulled her hand away, and the cut was gone. Not healing, not scabbed over. It was simply gone. The skin was flawless, as if the injury had never happened. Riker stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes had just seen. He had seen pack healers mend wounds, a process that took time, energy, and still left scars. He had never seen this. This was not the simple magic of herbs and poultices. This was something else, something pure and powerful and utterly terrifying. His suspicion and a reluctant, dangerous sense of awe crashed together inside him. The open loop of her mystery had just become a chasm. What was she, and what did a creature with power like that want with him and his pack? Chapter 8. A Whisper of Hope. The days that followed crawled by in a state of tense, unspoken truce. They shared the same vast space, but lived in different worlds. Riker buried himself in pack business, poring over maps and patrol reports at his great desk, using the weight of his duties as a shield against the woman who was a constant, unnerving presence in his sanctuary. He was the alpha, and this was a problem he could not solve with his teeth. Because he couldn't bring himself to harm her, and he couldn't bring himself to trust her, Isolde became a ghost in his chambers. She moved with a quiet grace, never speaking unless spoken to, which was never. She would sit for hours by the window that overlooked the forest, a deep, painful longing in her moss-green eyes. He could feel her loneliness through their bond, a dull ache behind his own ribs. It was a constant distraction, a weakness he couldn't afford. He watched her from the corner of his eye, the memory of that strange green light playing over and over in his mind. Their fragile stalemate was shattered by a frantic pounding on his chamber door. "Alpha Riker!" Riker was on his feet in an instant, a growl rumbling in his chest. "Enter!" The pack's elder healer, a wizened old wolf named Alara, burst in. Her face, usually so calm, was a mask of panic and grief. "It's Reese, Kale's boy. The fever came back, Alpha. It's burning through him. None of our remedies are working. He's fading." Riker felt a familiar, cold dread wash over him. Helplessness. The same feeling that had choked him as he watched his father's pack fall apart. To be an alpha, to be responsible for every life under your protection, and to be powerless to save one. It was the cruelest kind of failure. He could already hear the soft, heartbroken sobs of the pup's mother from down the hall. His gaze, against his will, flickered to Isolde. She had risen from her seat by the window, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a familiar, aching empathy. He saw the healer in her. He saw the same instinct that had moved her to save his sister, and he remembered the light. Isolde heard the words. Fever. Fading. Not working. Her entire being, every instinct she possessed as a healer, screamed in response. She knew the signs. A fire that burned from the inside out, consuming a life before it had even truly begun. She also knew the remedies, not the harsh medicines of the wolves, but the gentle, persistent magic of the earth. She watched the mighty Alpha Riker, and for the first time she didn't see a monster. She didn't see her captor. She saw a man being crushed under the weight of his crown. The pain on his face was so raw, so real. It resonated with a deep, forgotten part of her own lonely soul. He was terrified of failing his people. She took a breath. Her fear of him, of his pack, was a cold stone in her stomach. But the thought of that little boy, dying just a few doors away, that was a far greater fear. Her life had been quiet, but it had always been purposeful. Her purpose was to heal. What was her life worth if she stood by and did nothing? Taking a hesitant step forward, she found her voice. It was small, but steady. I think I can help." The room went silent. Alara stared at her with wide, suspicious eyes. But Riker's gaze locked on her. He was wrestling with a choice she could see warring in his stormy eyes. The logical alpha, the protector of pack tradition, screamed at him to refuse, to trust his own. But the desperate leader, the man who couldn't bear to lose another life, was listening. She saw the moment the decision was made, the moment he chose to gamble. He gave a single, sharp nod. His voice was rough, a command wrapped in desperation. "Show me." He turned and strode toward the door, not waiting to see if she would follow. He was trusting her. He was testing her. He was leading her out of the cage and into the lion's den. As Isolde walked behind him, out into the hostile quiet of the hallway, she could feel the eyes of the pack gathering. She could feel their suspicion, their hatred. And watching from the shadows at the far end of the hall, she saw the beta, Damon, his face a perfect mask of concern that didn't fool her for a second. The look in his eyes was not one of hope for a dying child. It was the look of a spider watching a fly walk willingly into its web. Chapter 9. The Withering Vine. In the week that followed the healing of the pup, a fragile, tentative peace settled over the pack house. The glares that had followed Isolde's every move softened into looks of cautious curiosity. A few of the pack mothers would offer her hesitant smiles. One even brought her a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was the first gift she'd received in a lifetime, and she treasured it. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, Isolde allowed herself to feel a whisper of something she had long forgotten: hope. But the hope was a lie. A beautiful, cruel lie. Because while the pack was starting to see a healer, the curse inside her was starting to see a threat. The energy she had used to save the pup had not been freely given. The curse had exacted a price. The quiet, humming sickness that had lived in her veins for as long as she could remember was no longer quiet. It had woken up, and it was hungry. It started as a simple weariness, a coldness deep in her bones that no roaring fire in the Alpha's chambers could touch. Then, food began to taste like ash in her mouth. The vibrant colors of the world seemed to fade, as if she were looking at everything through a dusty gray veil. She felt like a vine being slowly starved of sunlight, withering from the inside out. Her own magic, once a comforting wellspring of life within her, felt thin and distant. She did her best to hide it. She would force herself to eat, to smile at the pack members who were finally showing her kindness. She refused to be a burden. Not now. Not when she was so close to something that felt almost like belonging. But how long can you pretend to be alive when you feel yourself dying? Riker felt it as a constant, aggravating echo in the back of his own mind. A phantom ache that settled deep in his joints. A profound exhaustion that even a full night's sleep couldn't erase. He was feeling her. Through the bond he had fought so hard to deny, her suffering was bleeding into him. He watched her across the room, a book resting unread in her lap. She was paler than she had been a week ago. The subtle glow of life that had first captivated him was dimming, and the shadows under her eyes were like faint purple bruises. His wolf, the part of him that had already accepted her completely, was in a state of constant low-grade panic. It paced the confines of his soul, whining with a worry that scraped his nerves raw. His control, the ironclad discipline he had built his entire life around, was fraying. He found himself snapping at his warriors over minor infractions. His patience, already thin, was non-existent. He was a storm cloud looking for a place to break, because he was utterly, terrifyingly helpless, and he hated it. "She needs to eat more," he'd growled at Alara, the pack healer, 2 days ago. The old wolf had simply shaken her head, her eyes full of a pity that infuriated him. "It is not a malady of the body, Alpha. Her spirit is fading. Our tonics and herbs can't touch a thing like that." Her spirit was fading. The words haunted him. He didn't understand what they meant, but they filled him with a cold, primal fear he hadn't felt since the night his father died. He was losing her, this woman who had crashed into his life like a meteor, this witch who was his mate. He was losing her, and he didn't even know what he was fighting against. He was in the pack's library, ostensibly reviewing trade ledgers, but his focus was shot. He could feel her just down the hall, a flickering candle in a rising wind. Then the flicker became a spike of pure, unadulterated agony through the bond. It was so sharp, so sudden, it felt like a physical knife in his gut. He shot to his feet, the heavy oak table rattling. The ledger tumbled to the floor. He didn't notice. He was already moving, drawn by the invisible string of her pain, his heart hammering against his ribs with a single desperate thought. Isolde. He burst into the small study where she sometimes sat. He was just in time to see her rise from her chair, her face a mask of shock and pain before her legs gave out from under her. The world went black at the edges for her, a final, silent scream echoing in her soul as she fell. He crossed the room in a single, desperate lunge, catching her before she hit the unforgiving stone floor. Her body was terrifyingly light, trembling violently in his arms like a snared bird. Her skin was as cold as a winter grave, and in that moment, Riker knew. This wasn't a sickness. This was a poison, and it was stealing the life from both of them. Chapter 10. The Alpha's Heart Panic. Raw, undiluted, animalistic panic. It was an emotion Riker had long considered a fatal weakness, an indulgence he had ruthlessly purged from himself. But as he held Isolde's limp, cold body, it consumed him. Her breathing was a shallow, pathetic whisper against his chest. Her life was guttering out like a candle flame, and all he could do was watch. "Alara!" His roar was a desperate, broken thing. "Get in here! Now!" He carried her back to his chambers, his long strides frantic. He laid her down on the dark furs of his bed, and the sight of her, so pale and still against the black fur, shattered the last remaining pieces of his iron control. This was not a witch's trick. This wasn't a test. This was death, a patient predator, circling his mate. And all the power of his alpha title, all the strength of his pack, all the fury he possessed. It was useless against it. In that moment, everything else burned away. The suspicion, the resentment of the bond, the years of trauma that taught him to trust no one. It all turned to ash. And from those ashes rose a single, terrifying, undeniable truth. He loved her. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But he loved this quiet, gentle witch with a ferocity that eclipsed the sun, and he was not going to let her go. His wolf howled in his soul, a sound of pure, heart-wrenching grief. But beneath the grief was a desperate, ancient knowledge. A legend. A myth whispered about only in the oldest of tales. The ultimate sacrifice. An alpha could pour their own life force, their own raw power into another. It was a gamble that could shatter his own soul, leaving him a husk, or it could kill them both. He didn't hesitate. A life without her wasn't a life. It was just a continuation of the gray, empty hell he'd been living in since his father's death. He knelt beside the bed. He placed his hands on her chest, right over her faintly beating heart. He closed his eyes. He reached deep inside himself, past the rage, past the grief, to the core of his power, the living, breathing heart of the Alpha. And with a guttural cry that was both a prayer and a command, he pushed. Isolde was drowning. She was sinking into a cold, silent, black ocean. The curse was a chain of ice wrapped around her soul, pulling her down into a peaceful, welcoming oblivion. It would be so easy to just stop fighting. So easy to just sleep. But then, a light. It started as a tiny spark deep within her, a single defiant ember in the crushing darkness. Then, with the force of a supernova, it exploded. It was a tidal wave of warmth, of life, of pure, untamed power. It was him. It was his strength, his energy, his very soul rushing into the empty, dying spaces inside her. The sensation was overwhelming. It was the sun on your face after a lifetime of winter. It was the first clean breath after nearly drowning. It was life, raw and unfiltered and magnificent. The icy chains of the curse didn't break, but for the first time she felt them loosen their grip. The cold receded. The darkness fled. She could breathe. She felt him. Not just his power, but him. His pain, his grief for his father, his crippling fear of failure. And under it all, a love for her so fierce and bright it brought tears to her eyes. Their souls didn't just touch, they slammed into each other, merging, weaving together until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. A wave of pure energy erupted from them, a silent shockwave that made the very stones of the castle tremble. Riker gasped, feeling the backlash, but it wasn't painful. It was purifying. He felt her light, her gentle healing magic, flooding the dark and broken corners of his own soul. It didn't erase his scars, but it balanced them. For one breathtaking, infinite moment, his darkness was met with her light, and they were whole. He knew, with a certainty that was as real as the beating of his own heart, that the curse was real. Their bond was real, and it was the only weapon they would ever have. Just as the brilliant halo of energy around them began to fade, the heavy chamber door creaked open. The oldest elder of the pack, a wolf named Gideon, whose eyes held the wisdom of a century, stood in the doorway. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't shocked. His ancient face was a mask of deep, knowing sorrow. He looked at them, at Riker's hands still resting on his oldest chest, at the undeniable power still humming in the air between them. His voice was like the rustling of ancient, brittle leaves. "So," he rasped, "the twin blood bond has awoken. The curse has chosen its generation." Chapter 11. The Alpha's Vow. The elder Gideon's words fell into the silence of the room like ancient stones, heavy with the weight of a history Riker had never known. Twin blood bond, the name of their affliction, the name of the curse that had been slowly killing Isolde while fueling his own rage. Riker looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a witch or a mystery, but the other half of a shattered whole. The curse wasn't just in her. It was in them. Gideon's voice was a dry rasp, telling a story of a forgotten time, an Alpha's daughter, a witch of light, betrayed by the man she loved. In her grief, she had cursed their bloodlines, twisting the sacred mate bond into a parasite. A bond that would link a descendant of her light with a descendant of his darkness. The curse would feed on the darkness, the rage, the trauma, the pain. And to fuel it, it would drain the life, the light, from the other. "It is a curse of hatred," Gideon finished, his old eyes filled with a deep sadness. "It can only be broken by an act that is its opposite, an act of pure trust, of absolute forgiveness." The words settled in Riker's soul and solidified into a terrifying, unshakable resolve. For years he had honored his father's memory by nurturing his own darkness, sharpening his rage into a weapon to protect his pack. And all that time, that very weapon had been slowly murdering the woman destined to be his. The irony was a blade in his gut. His strength was her poison. His path was suddenly, brutally clear. He could not be the Alpha he had been. That man would kill her. He had to become something else. Something more. He turned to Isolde. The fear was still in her eyes, but underneath it was a new, resilient strength. She had heard the same story. She now understood the invisible chain that had tethered her to a lifetime of sickness and loneliness. "I am going to address the pack," he said, his voice quiet but with a new quality to it. Not the cold command of before, but the steady, unbreakable force of a turning tide. "And you will stand with me." Isolde listened to the old wolf's tale, and the fractured pieces of her life finally slammed into place. The constant fatigue, the feeling of being drained, the inexplicable loneliness. She hadn't just been a sickly child. She had been one half of a cursed bond, tethered to a stranger's pain across miles and years. She looked at Riker, this terrifying, magnificent man, and saw him not as her captor, but as her fellow prisoner, chained to the same dark legacy. When he spoke, his voice sent a shiver through her. He was going to face his people not just for himself but for them. He was choosing to stand with the witch he'd intended to kill, the woman his pack saw as an enemy. He was choosing her. The thought was so overwhelming, so terrifying, and so wonderful that it stole her breath. He held out his hand, not a command, an invitation. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. She placed her small, trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. A promise. He led her from the quiet of his chambers back into the heart of the den. The great hall was filled with the low, anxious rumbles of the pack. They had felt the surge of power from his room, and it had put them on edge. As Riker and Isolde emerged, a tense silence fell. Riker walked to the center of the room, his hand still holding hers, a silent, defiant claim. He stood before them, not just as their alpha, but as a male protecting his mate. His voice rang with a power no one had ever heard from him before. "You have questions," he began, his stormy gaze sweeping over his people. "You feel a shift in the air. You are right to be wary, but you are wrong to be afraid." He lifted their joined hands. "This is Isolde. She is not our enemy. She is my fated mate." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. "She is your Luna," he continued, his voice rising, cutting through the noise. "We have been bound together by an ancient curse, a curse that has been a shadow on this pack for generations. It is the source of the sickness that has plagued our bloodline, and it is the reason I have been the alpha I have been." It was a confession, a moment of pure, shocking vulnerability. "My strength has been feeding this curse, but no longer. We will not be ruled by this shadow. We will not be victims of the past. We will face this together. We will break it. I will protect her, and she will heal us." He looked down at Isolde, and for the first time, he let his pack see the fierce, undeniable love in his eyes. It was a vow, a public, unbreakable vow. In the back of the crowd, Damon watched, his face a perfect mask of impassive loyalty. But his eyes were chips of black ice, burning with a cold, murderous fury. His carefully laid plans were turning to dust. The alpha was healing. The key was bonding with him. It was all going wrong. As the pack stared, stunned into a mixture of awe and confusion, Damon slipped away, a ghost fading into the shadows of the hallway. He had one last card to play. A poison for a poison. Chapter 12. The Poisoned Well. The dawn that followed Riker's vow brought with it not hope, but a new kind of terror. The pack was in turmoil, a sea of confused whispers and anxious glances. Some looked at Isolde with a newfound respect, others with a deeper, more profound fear. But their internal debate was cut short by a cry of alarm from the courtyard. Wolves were sick. Not the lingering illness of the curse, but a violent, fast-acting sickness that left them weak and trembling, their breath coming in ragged gasps. It started with the warriors who'd taken the first drink of the morning from the pack's central well, but within an hour, a dozen more had fallen ill, their mates and pups crying in fear. The wellspring, the very heart of the pack's life, had been poisoned, and every single suspicious eye turned to Isolde. The whispers started again, this time venomous and sharp. The witch did it. A trick to gain our trust. She's weakening us for an attack. The fragile bridge of acceptance she had taken a single step onto had just been burned to the ground. She stood beside Riker, the hatred of the pack a physical force pushing her away, and the cold tendrils of despair began to creep back into her heart. Had she been a fool to hope? But then she looked at Riker. He stood like a mountain between her and the snarling faces of his people. His trust in her was absolute, a silent, unshakable shield, and it gave her the strength to fight. "Let me see," she said, her voice clear and steady. She knelt by the stone edge of the well, ignoring the growls. She didn't need to taste the water. She held her hand over it, closing her eyes, reaching out with the part of her that was more than just human. The magic in the water was dark, twisted. Wolfsbane, yes. But it was laced with something else. An accelerant. A hateful, corrupted magic designed to kill. Alpha, you must see the truth. Damon was at Riker's side, his voice ringing with false sorrow, loud enough for everyone to hear. She has fooled you. We welcomed a viper into our home, and now she strikes. Riker's pack was on the edge of a riot. His beta was inciting it. The old Riker, the one ruled by suspicion, would have dragged Isolde to the cells himself. But that Riker was gone. He could feel her innocence, her fierce determination through the bond. She was not the viper. Be silent. Riker's voice was a low, dangerous growl. He put a protective hand on Isolde's shoulder. He trusted her. That was his new vow. Just as a group of warriors started to surge forward, a voice, weaker but just as fierce, cut through the chaos. Stop it! All of you, you're wrong! The crowd parted. Lyra stood there, leaning heavily on the arm of the elder healer, Alara. She was pale, but her eyes blazed with the fire of an Alpha's daughter. She didn't hurt me, Lyra said, her voice gaining strength. She saved me. I was attacked by that rogue. I was bleeding. I was terrified. But I felt a light, a warmth. I didn't run from her cabin. I ran to it. Because somehow I knew I would be safe there. Lyra's testimony was a stone dropped into a still pond, its ripples shattering Damon's accusations. The anger in the crowd faltered, replaced by confusion. Isolde rose to her feet, empowered by the girl's bravery. The poison in the well is too deep. It's bound by a dark magic I can't undo all at once, she said, her eyes finding Riker's. But there is a stream, the one that runs behind the training grounds. It is fresh. It is clean. If you help me, if you lend me your strength, I can purify it. It was a public test of their bond. In front of the entire pack, Riker moved to stand behind her. He placed his hands on her shoulders, and she felt his power, the raw, immense energy of the Alpha, flow into her. It was not a violation. It was a gift. She knelt by the gurgling stream. She plunged her hands into the cold, clear water. A brilliant emerald light erupted from her palms, pulsing with the combined power of the witch and her Alpha. The light spread, flowing with the current, burning away any trace of the poison. It was a miracle of life and light, a fleeting, beautiful victory. Every eye in the stunned crowd turned from the glowing stream to the one person who had been so certain of Isolde's guilt, Damon. He saw it, the suspicion in their eyes, the dawning horror on the faces of those who had followed him. He was trapped, his betrayal laid bare for all to see. With a snarl that was purely animal, he shoved one of his own warriors into Riker's path. He bolted. He ran for the dark safety of the tree line. Just before he was swallowed by the shadows, he put 2 fingers to his lips and let out a piercing, unnatural whistle. It wasn't a signal to his pack. It was a call to an enemy. Then he was gone. But the promise of his signal hung in the air, a terrifying omen of the battle that was to come. Chapter 13. The Serpent's Tooth. The echo of Damon's whistle was a poisoned dart in the heart of the pack's fragile victory. It hung in the air, a promise of something terrible. Chaos erupted. Riker's warriors, still reeling from their beta's betrayal, scrambled to form a defensive line. Riker's mind raced, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. Damon. His friend, his brother, the one person he had trusted without question for his entire life. The betrayal wasn't just a knife in the back. It was a poison that rewrote his entire past into a lie. He didn't have to wait long for the other shoe to drop. They came out of the forest like shadows detaching from the trees. Wolves. Dozens of them. Their fur was mottled gray and black, their scent sharp with the aggression of a rival pack. The Black River Pack. And leading them, his scarred face twisted in a triumphant sneer, was their alpha, Kalen. But it was the wolf walking calmly at Kalen's side that made Riker's blood run cold. Damon. He looked at home. He belonged there. The site was so fundamentally wrong, so completely alien, that for a moment, Riker's mind simply refused to accept it. Then the attack came. The world exploded into a symphony of snarls, the wet tear of claws on flesh, the sickening crunch of bone. Riker met the charge, his grief and rage twisting into a deadly, focused fury. He fought like a cornered god, a whirlwind of black fur and flashing claws, his only thought to protect the woman who stood behind him. He was the shield. He would not break. He saw Damon across the fray, watching, not fighting. Just watching, a clinical detachment in his eyes. This was his plan. All of it. The rogue wolf, the masked scent, the poison. Every step had been perfectly calculated, because he had known every weakness Riker possessed. Isolde's world was a blur of violence and terror. One moment she was a healer, a beacon of hope. The next, she was huddled behind a wall of raging fury as Riker tried to hold back the tide of a war she didn't understand. She felt utterly, terrifyingly useless. The air was thick with so much hatred, so much bloodlust that it choked her own magic, making her feel weak and sick. She saw wounded Moonwood wolves go down, and her healer's instincts screamed at her to help. She tried to focus, to summon the gentle green light, but it was like trying to light a candle in a hurricane. The sheer brutality of the scene was a poison to her gentle power. The fighting seemed to swirl around a central point of calm. Riker, Kaelin, and Damon, the traitor. As if by some unspoken signal, the chaos receded, leaving the three of them in a tense, snarling standoff in the center of the clearing. Riker's chest was heaving, his body covered in blood. Some his, some not. "Why?" he roared, the single word filled with a universe of pain and confusion. "I trusted you. You were my brother." Damon actually laughed. It was a cold, ugly sound, completely devoid of the warmth she'd once heard in it. "Brother?" he sneered, his handsome face twisting into a mask of pure contempt. "No, I was your keeper, your father. He was a good man, and his goodness got him and half his pack slaughtered. I watched you, a pup full of fire and grief, and I saw a perfect weapon, a leader who could be forged in hatred, who would never make the same mistake. I guided you. I sharpened your rage. I helped you become the cold, ruthless alpha this pack needed to survive." He took a step forward. "Everything was perfect. You were the fist, and I was the brain. But then she came." His cold eyes landed on Isolde, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. The little key, the witch from the prophecy destined to break the curse. You were supposed to kill her, but you felt for her. You started to heal. You were becoming your father all over again. Weak. Damon's final words were a dagger aimed straight at Riker's deepest wound. "I didn't betray you, Riker. I tried to save you from yourself, just like I tried to save your father when I told Kaelin's father exactly where he'd be that night." The confession hit Riker with the force of a physical blow. The betrayal was so absolute, so monumental, it shattered his reality. His father's death, his whole life, a lie. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with a pain that went beyond comprehension. And in that moment of weakness, Kaelin and his warriors struck, a blur of gray fur and flashing teeth. Riker tried to fight back, but his strength, his will, his very soul had been broken. He went down under a wave of bodies, a choked, defeated cry torn from his throat. Chapter 14. An Echo of Silence. The fighting stopped. As quickly as it had begun, an eerie, unnatural silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the pained whimpers of the wounded. Riker was on the ground, pinned beneath two of Kaelin's largest warriors, his face pressed into the dirt and blood-soaked leaves. He wasn't fighting back. "Riker!" Isolde's scream was a raw, ragged tear in the quiet. She tried to run to him, to do something, anything, but a hand like an iron vice clamped down on her arm. Damon. He yanked her back, his touch brutal and cold. The friendly, charming mask he had worn for so long was gone, revealing the ugly, reptilian cruelty that had been hiding underneath all along. "Don't be a fool, little Key," he hissed, his breath foul against her ear. "He can't help you. You belong to a winner now." He began to drag her away, toward Kaelin, who was watching with a hungry, triumphant look in his eyes. Isolde struggled, pulling against his grip, her heels digging uselessly into the soft earth. But it was no use. She was a bird in a serpent's coils. Her eyes were locked on Riker. She saw the devastation on his face, the utter, soul-deep brokenness. It was the look of a king whose castle had crumbled to dust around him. She knew, with a sudden, terrible clarity, that if he saw her fear, if he saw her break, it would be the final blow. It would extinguish the last spark of the great alpha he was. So she did the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. She stopped struggling. She made herself go still. She lifted her chin, and into her moss-green eyes, she poured every last ounce of her will, her defiance, her stubborn hope, and her desperate, all-consuming love for him. Her look was not a plea for help. It was a command, a silent, screaming promise. "This is not the end. I will not break. So you are not allowed to either. Live for me." He could only watch, a pathetic, useless, broken thing on the ground. He heard her scream his name, and the sound was a brand on his soul. He saw Damon's filthy hands on her, and a helpless rage so profound it had no sound churned in his gut. He strained against the weight of the wolves pinning him, but his muscles wouldn't obey. His strength was gone, bled out not by wounds, but by the poison of Damon's words. "I told them where he'd be." The phrase echoed in the shattered ruins of his mind. His father's death wasn't a tragedy of weakness. It was a calculated assassination. And the man he called brother was the architect. His entire life, every brutal training session, every cold command, every sleepless night spent honoring a ghost, it had all been a lie. A grand, cruel puppet show. And Damon had held all the strings. He had failed. In the end, he was just as weak as he'd always believed his father to be. He had been outsmarted. He had been broken. He had lost his pack, his past, and now he was losing his mate. He met Isolde's gaze as they dragged her away. He was expecting to see the terror he felt reflected in her eyes. He was expecting tears, begging. Instead, he saw a fire. He saw a queen, not a captive. He saw a resolve so fierce and bright it momentarily stunned him. It was a look that didn't ask for rescue but demanded his survival. It was a tiny, impossible spark of light in a universe of absolute darkness. It wasn't enough to stop the despair that was rushing in to drown him. But it was something to hold on to as the water closed over his head. He watched until she disappeared between the dark, silent trunks of the trees. Her captors retreated, taking their victory with them. The Black River wolves released him, leaving him in a heap on the ground. Riker lay there, amidst the wounded and the dying, the sole survivor of his own private apocalypse. The world was muted, gray. The sounds of pain and grief from his pack were a distant buzz. For the first time since he was a pup, his wolf was silent. Not snarling, not howling, not pacing, utterly, terrifyingly still. It was crushed by a despair so total, so absolute it had no voice. He was truly, completely alone. A king of ashes. Chapter 15. The embers of a king consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a slow, agonizing crawl out of a deep, gray pit. Riker's first sensation was the scratch of a wool blanket against his cheek. His second was the profound, deafening silence in his own soul. The wolf was gone. Not dead, but dormant, buried under a landslide of despair so heavy it had snuffed out his inner fire. He was a king of ashes, and the taste of it was bitter in his mouth. He opened his eyes. He wasn't on the blood-soaked ground of the battlefield. He was in the healer's den, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs. Lyra was sitting in a chair beside his cot, her face pale and drawn, her eyes full of a pain that mirrored his own. The ancient elder, Gideon, stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the weak morning light. Riker tried to sit up, a groan of pure self-loathing escaping his lips. I failed, he rasped, the words a confession of his ultimate sin. I lost her. You lost a battle, boy, not the war. Gideon's voice was like stones grinding together. Though you are doing your damnedest to lose that too. The old wolf turned, his eyes piercing. Do you feel that emptiness? That hollowness in your spirit? That is the curse feeding. It feasts on your despair. Every moment you lie here, drowning in your failure, you are tightening its grip on her. You are becoming the poison that kills her. The words were brutal, but they were a spark in the suffocating darkness. Lyra moved to the edge of the cot. She knew you wouldn't give up, she whispered, her voice trembling. She opened her hand. Resting on her palm was a small, smooth river stone. Etched into its surface was a single, spiraling vine, glowing with a soft, internal light. She gave this to me after she healed me, Lyra explained. She called it a seed of light, a promise that even in the dark, things can grow. Riker stared at the glowing symbol. It was a tangible piece of her hope, of her gentle, defiant magic. He could almost feel the warmth of her touch on the stone. She had faced down his rage, his pack's hatred, and now her own capture, and she had never stopped fighting. She had never lost hope. How could he? The despair didn't vanish, but deep within the ashes of his soul, a single tiny ember began to glow. He was done fighting for vengeance. He was done being the ruthless alpha his trauma had created. That man had failed. He would have to become someone else, the man she believed him to be. Isolde sat in a cage of luxury. The room Kaelin had given her was filled with furs and silks, but the windows were barred, and the door was guarded by 2 hulking wolves. Kaelin, the rival alpha, brought her food on silver trays, his eyes filled with a greedy, possessive light. He saw her as a trophy, a source of power to be conquered. But it was Damon who truly terrified her. He would visit her, his smile a cold, clinical thing. He would ask her questions about her magic, about the curse, trying to understand how to wield her as a weapon. Through the bond, she felt Riker. For the first day, his presence had been a crushing wave of despair, a cold, empty void that had terrified her more than her captors. But then, something had shifted. The overwhelming grief had receded, replaced by something new. A single, steady point of warmth. It was small, but it was there. A flicker of resolve. She reached into a small pouch hidden in the folds of her dress and pulled out a matching river stone, its surface smooth and dark. Closing her eyes, she poured every ounce of her own hope, her own light, into it. A desperate, silent prayer across the miles. I am here. I am waiting. Do not let your fire go out. Riker pushed himself out of the cot. His movements were stiff, pained, but they were no longer the movements of a defeated man. The hollowness was still there, but the ember of purpose was growing, fed by the image of that glowing stone. He would not be the curse's weapon. He would be its end. He looked at his sister, his eyes clear for the first time in a decade. Gather the loyal, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that held a new kind of power. Tell them their alpha is not dead yet. Chapter 16. A Pack of Lions. The Great Hall was a hollow, wounded thing, half empty. The air was thick with the smell of blood and fear. But standing before Riker was not the whole of his pack. It was the heart of it. Lyra stood at his side. Ilara, the healer, was there, her face grim but resolute. Kyle, the warrior Riker had once shamed for a moment of weakness, stood at the front, his expression unreadable. Behind them were a dozen more, the silent hunters, the steadfast guards, the ones whose loyalty had never wavered, not to the title of Alpha, but to the spirit of the pack. They were few, but they were strong. The old Riker would have given them a speech full of fire and vengeance. He would have given them orders, expecting them to be obeyed without question. That Riker was a ghost. This new Riker did something far more terrifying. He made himself vulnerable. Damon was right about one thing, he began, his voice quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the hushed hall. My father's kindness was seen as a weakness, and after he died, I swore I would never be weak. I built my reign on fear and rage, because I believed it was the only way to keep you safe. He took a breath, meeting the eyes of each wolf before him. I was wrong. He told them everything, about the twin blood bond, about the curse that fed on his darkness and drained Isolde's light. He told them how his own rage, the very shield he had used to protect them, was the weapon that was killing their Luna. He did not ask for their pity. He did not make excuses. He simply laid his broken soul bare for them to see. I cannot defeat them as the alpha I was, he finished, his voice raw with a humility they had never heard before. That man is a part of this curse. I can only win as the man my mate needs me to be, and I cannot do it alone. I am not asking you to follow my orders. I am asking you to fight with me, as family. Silence. A thick, heavy silence. Then Kyle stepped forward. He looked at Riker, not with fear, but with a new, profound respect. You were hard on us, Alpha, Kyle said, his voice rough. You pushed us until we bled, because you never wanted to see us bleed in a real fight. Your rage was a shield for all of us. Now it's our turn to be the shield for you. One by one, others stepped forward. Elara, Marcus, the silent trackers. They pledged their loyalty not to a tyrant, but to a brother. Not to an infallible alpha, but to a humbled, honest man. His vulnerability had not broken them. It had forged them into something stronger than steel. Their planning session was not a council of war. It was a family meeting. They would not charge the Black River Den. That would be a massacre. They would be smarter. Elara knew of a combination of herbs that could mask their scents from even the sharpest nose. Lyra, from her runs, remembered a series of old game trails that led to the back of their territory, bypassing the main patrols. Their strategy was not to conquer. It was a rescue mission. The goal was simple: get Riker to Isolde. Because their bond, now that he had embraced it, was their most powerful weapon. They would move like ghosts, a small, deadly pride of lions, not a charging herd of bulls. As the moon rose high in the sky, Riker stood before his small band of warriors. They were few, but they were his true pack. He was no longer a king of ashes. He was their alpha. For our Luna, he said, his voice calm and clear. And together, they melted into the shadows of the forest, the hunt for their queen finally beginning. Chapter 17. The Scent of a Storm. The forest at night was a different world. A world of secrets and shadows. Under the dim light of the crescent moon, Riker and his small team moved with the silence of ghosts. The herbs Elara had given them worked like a charm, cloaking their scents in the smells of damp earth and crushed pine, rendering them invisible to any patrols. For the first time in 10 years, Riker's mind was completely, utterly clear. The constant, simmering rage that had been his companion for so long was gone. In its place was a calm, cold focus. A perfect clarity. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, every shift in the wind was a piece of information he processed with an efficiency he had never known. His rage had made him strong, yes, but this purpose, this made him lethal. They crossed the invisible line that marked the border of the Black River Pack's territory. The air changed. It felt heavier, tainted with the scent of aggression and old blood. And then he caught it. It was faint, a mere whisper on the wind, but it was as unmistakable to him as his own heartbeat. Lilac and old books. Isolde, his wolf, silent for so long, stirred within him. Not with a roar, but with a low, deep hum of pure focus. But her beautiful scent was tangled with something else, the foul, coppery stench of Kalen's ambition. And underneath it all, the sickly, sweet smell of decay that always seemed to cling to Damon. The combination didn't ignite Riker's rage. It did something else. It chilled his resolve, hardening it from fiery purpose into something as pure, sharp, and unbreakable as a diamond. He knew what he was fighting for. He knew what he was fighting against. And he knew, with every fiber of his being, that he would not fail. He was getting closer. Isolde was a doll in a box, a pretty silent thing for her captors to observe. Kaelin would parade her through his great hall, showing her off like a prize. Damon would continue his quiet interrogations, his questions becoming more pointed, more dangerous, as he tried to pry the secrets of her magic from her mind. "The curse makes you a key little witch," he'd said, his voice a silky threat. "But a key is useless if you don't know which lock it opens. Tell me." She resisted. She built walls of quiet defiance in her mind. She gave them nothing. Her strength came from the bond. The crushing despair that had flooded her connection to Riker was gone. In its place, she felt a steady, determined warmth, a beacon in the darkness. It was no longer a desperate ember. It was a growing flame. He's coming. The knowledge was a secret she held in her heart, a shield against their threats and their promises. She was sitting by the barred window of her room, looking out at the moon, when she felt it. A sudden sharp pulse through the bond, a flare of his presence. He was no longer miles away. He was close, so close. Hope, so fierce and sharp it was almost a pain, flooded her. "Hurry," she prayed, her hand clutching the smooth, dark stone in her pocket. "I'm here." Riker and his team crept to the edge of the tree line. Before them lay the Black River encampment. It was a fortress. A rough-hewn wall of sharpened logs encircled a compound of hastily built structures. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their snarling faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight. In the center of it all was the Alpha's lodge, a large, brutish building from which the scent of Isolde, Kaelin, and Damon emanated most strongly. The odds were impossible. Suicidal, even. A dozen wolves against 50 or more. But Riker felt her. He felt her sudden spike of hope through the bond, a silent answer to his arrival. It was a call, a confirmation, a plea. She was in there. She was waiting. He looked at Kael, at Marcus, at the handful of loyal warriors who had followed him into the heart of the enemy's den. He saw no fear in their eyes, only the same grim, diamond-hard resolve that he felt in his own soul. They were outnumbered. They were outmatched. But they would not be outfought. He raised his hand, the moonlight glinting off his claws. He gave the silent, simple signal. Advance. Chapter 18. The Heart of the Curse. The night exploded in chaos. On the far side of the Black River encampment, a storehouse erupted in a brilliant plume of fire, a diversion orchestrated with perfect timing. Shouts of alarm and confusion split the air. In that moment of distraction, Riker and his lions moved. They were a blade of shadow and purpose, slicing through the disorganized defenses, their goal singular and absolute. The Alpha's lodge. Riker was the tip of the spear. He didn't roar. He didn't waste energy on displays of rage. He was a silent, focused storm. He burst through the heavy doors of the lodge, his eyes instantly finding her. Isolde. She was flanked by 2 hulking guards, their hands clamped on her arms. Standing before her, a smug, possessive look on his face, was the rival Alpha, Kaelin, and beside him, the serpent himself, Damon. "Right on time," Damon sneered. Kaelin let out a low, rumbling growl. "You are a fool to come here, Moonwood. You are outnumbered. Your pack is broken." "My pack is stronger than you could ever imagine." Riker's voice was a low, calm promise of violence. He charged. Kaelin met him, a clash of 2 alphas that shook the foundations of the room. They were a blur of claws and teeth, a brutal dance of power. But Riker was not the same wolf he had been. His movements were not fueled by the wild, sloppy rage of his past. They were precise, controlled. Every block, every strike had a purpose, to close the distance to his mate. He was a shield, not a berserker. "He's mine," a familiar voice snarled. Kael, Riker's warrior, slammed into Damon, intercepting the traitor before he could flank his alpha. Their own bitter battle erupted in the corner of the room, a personal vendetta finally being settled. Isolde felt the eruption of violence, and the curse inside her screamed with delight. It was a creature of hatred, and this was its feast. She felt the ancient, vengeful spirit of her ancestor rise up, whispering poison in her soul. Hate them. Let them destroy each other. This is justice. The darkness was seductive, a comforting blanket of old pain. But through the bond she felt something else. She felt Riker. It wasn't the storm of his old rage. It was a steady, warm, and unwavering light. A love so pure and focused, it was a shield against the encroaching shadows. He was fighting for her, not for vengeance. He was protecting, not punishing. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. You couldn't fight a shadow with more shadows. You had to turn on the light. She closed her eyes, shutting out the physical battle raging around her. She turned her focus inward, to the ancient, wounded spirit of the betrayed witch who had started all of this. Instead of fighting it, instead of building walls against its pain, she opened her heart to it. She didn't try to silence the ancestor's grief. She listened. She felt the sting of betrayal, the agony of a broken heart, the bitter poison of a love curdled into hatred. And she answered it not with defiance, but with a wave of pure, unconditional empathy. I understand, she thought, the message a gentle whisper across the centuries. You were hurt, but your pain has become a cage for others. It is time to let it go. It is time to heal. She sent a wave of forgiveness flooding back through the bloodline. Forgiveness for the man who had betrayed the witch, forgiveness for the centuries of pain, and forgiveness for herself, for a lifetime of loneliness she hadn't understood. It was the key. A light, brilliant and pure white erupted from her. It was not a violent explosion, but a gentle, silent wave of pure grace. It washed through the room, through the walls, through every person present. The curse, a thing forged of shadow and hatred, could not exist in its presence. It didn't scream or fight. It simply dissolved, like a bad dream upon waking. Kaelin, whose own dark power had been secretly amplified by the ambient hatred of the curse, suddenly faltered. The unnatural strength drained from his limbs, leaving him confused and suddenly mortal. In that split second of weakness, Riker moved. He disarmed the rival Alpha, slamming him to the ground, his claws at Kaelin's throat. But he did not kill. The white light faded, leaving the air in the room feeling clean, fresh, and new. The battle was over. Riker shoved Kaelin aside and rushed to Isolde, his heart in his eyes. Chapter 19. Scars and Salves. The aftermath of the battle was strangely quiet. The Black River Wolves, their alpha defeated and the dark, aggressive influence that had clouded their minds now gone, looked around in a daze, as if waking from a long, angry dream. Riker's small, loyal pack moved with quiet efficiency, disarming their rivals and tending to the wounded, on both sides. It was the first official act of Riker's new reign, but Riker saw none of it. His world had narrowed to the woman standing in the center of the room, her spirit shining brighter than any star. He reached her, his hands hovering for a moment before gently cupping her face, his thumbs tracing the soft curve of her cheeks. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I am now," she whispered, her hand coming up to cover his. The bond between them was calm. The constant, painful static of the curse was gone. In its place was a steady, warm, and profoundly peaceful connection. It was a quiet river, not a raging storm. A true mate bond, purified. A flurry of motion came from the doorway. "Riker! Isolde!" Lyra rushed in, her face beaming. She was no longer pale or weak. The breaking of the curse had severed the last lingering tendrils of the illness that had plagued her. She was vibrant, whole. She threw her arms around both of them in a fierce, joyful hug. Riker held his mate and his sister, the two halves of his heart, and looked out at the scene. He saw the faces of the defeated wolves, the cost of the fight, the long road ahead. And he felt not the triumphant fire of a victor, but the heavy, humbling weight of a true leader. He pulled back slightly, his gaze locked on Isolde. In front of his sister, his most loyal warriors, and the defeated alpha of a rival pack, he did the one thing the old Riker would have rather died than do. He showed his scars. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice clear and strong, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "I'm sorry for my blindness, for my rage, for ever treating you like a prisoner when you were the one who was here to set me free. I was a broken man, Isolde, ruled by the ghosts of the past, and your light, your strength, you saved me from myself." He took a breath, sealing his vow not with a command, but with a humble truth. "I love you." Isolde listened to his words, and they were a healing salve on the last of her own invisible wounds. The years of loneliness, of feeling like an outcast, of being a prisoner in her own skin, it all washed away. She saw the absolute sincerity in his stormy eyes, the profound and permanent change in his very soul. He was not the monster who had broken down her door. He was the man who had been reborn to protect her. She didn't need to say the words back. He could feel it through the bond, a wave of love and acceptance so pure it made his heart ache. She simply raised a hand to his cheek, her touch conveying everything. Then, her gaze shifted to the wounded. Her purpose, so long clouded by the curse, was now crystal clear. She moved toward a young Black River wolf, his leg badly injured, and knelt beside him. Riker watched as his Luna, his mate, began to heal their enemies. She was already leading, not with power, but with grace. Kale dragged a bound and snarling Damon forward. The traitor's eyes were wild, his gamble lost. "What should we do with him, Alpha?" Riker looked at the man who had been his brother, and he felt nothing, just a quiet finality. He will face the judgment of the Alpha's council. His crimes are beyond the justice of one pack. The open loops were closing, the rivalries, the betrayals, the ancient hatreds. They were all ending right here tonight. All that was left was to build what came next. Chapter 20. The Rising Moon. A month later, the full moon shone down on a pack transformed. The air in the great hall of Moonwood was not filled with tension or fear, but with laughter and music. Pups tumbled and played on the furs, no longer flinching at every loud noise. Warriors who had once been rivals now shared drinks and stories. It was not a gathering of soldiers. It was a celebration of family. Riker stood on the Alpha's dais, Isolde's hand held firmly in his. He looked out at the faces of his people, and his heart was full. The ghosts were still there, but they were quiet now. Their pain was a part of his story, a scar that reminded him of the man he had been, not a wound that dictated the man he was. He was not an alpha of fear. He was an alpha of peace. He had finally brought his pack the safety his father had always dreamed of. Not just safety from attack, but the safety to be happy. Isolde stood beside him, her presence a calm, steady light. She was no longer an outsider. She was the heart of the pack. The wolves came to her not just for her healing touch, but for her gentle wisdom, her quiet strength. The profound loneliness that had been her only companion for her entire life had vanished, replaced by the warmth of 1,000 new connections. She looked at Riker, her mate, her partner, her love, and she knew she was finally, truly home. The bond between them was a quiet, beautiful song in their souls, a perfect harmony. Riker raised his hand, and a respectful silence fell over the hall. "Tonight," he began, his voice warm and resonant, "we don't celebrate a victory in battle. We celebrate a victory of the heart. We celebrate a new beginning." He squeezed Isolde's hand. "For too long, this pack has been guided by the shadows of the past, by my shadows. But our Luna has shown us a new way, a future built not on strength alone, but on trust, not on fear, but on compassion. Isolde stepped forward, her soft voice carrying a strength that commanded attention. "A scar is not a weakness," she said, her eyes finding Riker's. "It is a sign that you have healed. Our pack has many scars, but we are healing. Together." They stood together, two halves of a whole, their journey complete. He was no longer the ruthless alpha, and she was no longer the lonely witch. He was the just leader, the loving mate, the healed man. She was the revered healer, the beloved Luna, the woman who had found her home. They had faced a curse born of hatred and vengeance, and they had answered it with a love born from forgiveness and trust. Looking out at their thriving, happy pack under the light of the rising moon, they knew they had not just broken a curse. They had forged a new legacy,